everyone. Welcome to our Zip Chat episode 13 today. This is Jill Hurston. I'm the marketing director at Accelerate. We're so happy to have you all join us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Hemant Elhans. He is the president at Accelerate. Hemant, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jill, for getting this kicked off. And I'm so excited to have this topic covered in this Zip Chat format for us. Many of you, like us on this panel, have been around software industry for many, many years, and microservices has been a hot topic for well over a decade now. But this micro front ends is a relatively new term that start cropping up in my radar within last 12 months. So I'm just delighted that we have two really good experts on the panel today to explore this topic called micro front ends. So let me first do a quick intro, and then I'll let each of the panelists also introduce themselves more fully. So Luca Pezzalera is the principal solutions architect at AWS, and he's, in my opinion, somewhat of an authority on this topic of micro front ends. I got exposed to this topic thanks to a podcast that Luca was on and spoke on. So I'll let him talk a little more on his intro in a minute. And then I'm delighted to have Ben Battle. I've worked with Ben for a few years. Ben is a seasoned technology leader, has been there, done that in many, many companies. So great to have two real experts to explore this topic with us. I'm more of a outsider, new to this topic. So with that, let me let each, Luca, first you, and then Ben, introduce yourself, and then we'll start the exploration.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks also for defining me an expert on the topic. So my name is Luca. I'm, as you said, the principal solution architect in Amazon. Before that, I was working as vice president of architecture in a company called DAZN. It's a streaming platform. And there basically is where I fostered the idea of micro frontends. Where it allowed us to scale the organization end-to-end using microservices and micro frontends from few through tens of people to hundreds of techies. And we were able to use them not only on web, but also on TV applications. So also smart TV, so low-end devices. It was a paradigm that was fitting very well. And it's a topic that I'm following very closely because I believe we are in the middle of a revolution at the moment, and it's very interesting to provide the right importance not only to the backend but also to the front end.
Excellent. Thank you for that intro. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Hemant. And Luca, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ben Battle. I partnered with CenterZip now for Accelerate for a few years. More broadly, I served as a CTO for several, as Hemant said, SaaS-based businesses for a few decades now. I've seen and helped build service-based apps, some tiered with clean APIs and services, some not so much and quite monolithic. So I've seen a little bit of everything when it comes to SaaS-based systems. So I'm really excited about kind of the micro front-end approach and participating on this panel this afternoon, because it really seems to have the potential to help align people, align tech, align dev processes so the teams can deliver even greater business value. And that's what I'm all about. And looking forward to speaking with Luca about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So let's jump right in and start this exploration. We'll take questions along the way also there. Otherwise, we'll hold questions to the end. So this is a big topic. We'll have about 45 minutes or so, give or take, in this conversational format. So first thing, let me kick it off with helping define this topic itself, micro front end. Many of us have heard of it. It shows up in Gartner and other such technology adoption topics. Is this a new idea itself, Luca, or is this a name label given to an idea that has existed? Most good software people were already doing this practice before. So tell us what exactly is the micro front end?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the implementation part may or may not be already there. I think we come up with a realization on how really define front end. Because the reality of the things is when I started 6-7 years ago, there wasn't many people discussing about that. And when I started, basically, I had the challenge to design an architecture that was mimicking basically the benefit of microservices, but on the front end. And what I've done is starting from the principles. I took the principles of microservices, where you design your microservice in a way that is representing a business subdomain or a bounded or a part of the business subdomain related to a bounded context. And you have an independent system with not much that is shareable across multiple microservices. And all these principles basically were the base for and the foundation for creating then the North Star that we were following on Frontends. And that's exactly what we have done. So we started to, so for me, the definition of a microfrontend is an independent representation of a business subdomain that may or may not be developed with the same technology, and it doesn't share too much with other parts of the system, and is owned by a single team. It's very, very important also the ownership part, because if I truly believe that the DevOps model, where you build it, you run it, you own it, is the right way for developing software. And in this case, when we think about distributed systems, it is even more important, because we finally have the possibility to not have one solution that fits them all, but we can have instead the right solution for the challenge that we are facing. And therefore, in this way, we can really make our application shine and optimize where is possible and where is needed by different factors. Could be cost, it could be performance, it could be wherever we prefer, but we really can use the right tool for the job.
So let me push this a little further for the audience here. So for any engineering leader on the call today, what problem does micro frontend solve? What problem would they be observing in their world that they would think micro frontend is the answer to that?
Yeah, so many times when you work in an enterprise environment, you end up with similar problems of a monolithic code base that you have on the back end, also on the front end. Recently, I had the possibility to speak with some of our customers, where they were telling us the build of our system could take up to 50 minutes. So now you can imagine, when you have 50 minutes for building a front end, it means that given or take, you can deploy 6 times per day. That is not enough. You want a feedback loop that is fast. And in order to have a fast feedback loop, you need to modularize your code base. And also you need to create a deploy pipeline that would allow you to have fast feedback. Therefore, instead of building and maybe you change just, I don't know, a small part of a function and you wait 10 minutes before the build phase is done, you have instead, you change something and automatically in probably a few minutes, you see that in a staging environment or testing environment, wherever it is. That is the kind of feedback loop that you are looking for. And another problem that is solving microfrontends is the reducing the cognitive load for the teams. If before a team should know end-to-end the entire code base and at least have a sense of what was happening in different parts of the application, now they became domain experts on an area of the application, and they can take their own decision on how to make their business domain really shining. And finally, it's solving an organizational problem. Because the reality is, when you have tens or more people or hundreds of people that are working on the same code base, and maybe in a distributed fashion, it is complicated, because you maybe define some patterns or some best practices at the beginning of the project, and in a couple of years those best practices are obsolete, or you can apply different solutions that are making your application better. But for creating a cohesive and coherent code base, you need to stick with the initial ideas, because otherwise the refactoring would take too long, and you need also to ship features. So for all those, let's say, challenges, I think a distributed system like microfrontends can really help.
Excellent. This is very helpful, those 3 things you listed. Let me let Ben explore this further.
Sure. Look, I'm interested a little bit more in kind of the how and the what. and how you kind of start getting into this. And I'll kind of preface the question around, if you're building a system from scratch, that's one approach, versus refactoring. How do you think about those this in those two contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. In my experience, starting with a monolithic code base is still a valid point. I'm quite against saying, oh yeah, we need to start a new project. It's going to be massive in a few years' time. Let's go with microservices, micro frontends, because in reality, there is an intrinsic complexity of the architecture that is not related on the development phase, where you are definitely simplify because the bounded context that you create is small and the team can really develop the best that you can. But then behind that, you start to have, let's say, observability. You need to take care about consistency. You need to take care about deployment and build and testing and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of aspects that then start to be impacted. And yes, you are simplifying the development, but there is all the rest of the software development life cycle that could be impacted. So in my opinion, refactoring is definitely the best position for micro frontends, mainly for another important reason, because usually you start identifying what are the boundaries of your micro frontends, and for identify the boundaries, you need to be a domain expert. So you need to understand deeply how your application product, in this case, is working. You can, if you start from scratch, you can rely on the product team. And start to have a take from understanding from them how they envision that the user will use their product. But if you start from an existing product, you can really, through metrics, you can really understand how the application is consumed. And sometimes, in my experience at least, I have seen that the product people envision one scenario, but in reality, the user are doing something else. And those data points are extremely useful because are really helping you to shape the right, the first, let's say, split of micro frontends and domains and bounded context for then be applicable inside your content. One risk that I have seen, or an anti-pattern, if you want, when you start from scratch, is that the first thing that any front-end developer would do is trying to match a micro frontend to a component. And there we are basically losing the point around micro frontends, because if we are starting to think that a micro frontend is a component, we risk to go more granular and definitely too far, and we are risking to have what is called in microservices world the distributed monolith, classic anti-pattern, where you need to deploy everything together, and you have basically the worst scenario for both for the monolith and for a distributed system. So it's very, very important, in my opinion, that that at the beginning we sit down and we understand the business context for then deciding how to define the bounded context of our micro frontends.
That's great. You mentioned, kind of domain-driven decomposition or composition. Are there other, looking at, microservice-based approaches on the back end? Are there others that are kind of run in parallel beyond domain-driven composition when you're thinking about micro front ends?
Yeah, exactly. Because okay, let's fast forward for a moment in a hypothetical project where you have microservices and micro front ends. Ideally, if you have a cross-functional team, then you would be able to handle the a specific, let's say, bounded context end to end. And if you think about that, the beauty of this is that finally we will have teams that are really independent. They can take the right choice for the front end, for the back end, and for the infrastructure. So they can basically, in an enterprise environment, became a small startup that are expert on a specific area. They have their input and output, obviously, of their bounded context, and we are familiar with them when we think about microservices. So therefore, we need to identify what are the input and output for communicating inside the system. But in reality, if you think about that, the power of having a team that doesn't have external dependencies and that can really take ownership of what they are doing end to end is extremely powerful.
Yeah, indeed. Very much so. How about, is this an all or nothing approach? Perhaps, this is more of a, legacy refactor type of question, but is it something you can start to do partially? I think about approaches to kind of rebuilding back-end monoliths into service-based architectures and things like a strangler pattern. Can you think about micro front ends in a similar way when you think about, refactoring?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think is one of the thing that made me very proud the moment that we were able to create a strangler pattern for micro frontends, because and also canary releases. And in my last project, we were able using Lambda at the edge to shape the traffic towards a specific version of a micro frontend or the legacy project, based on the country of the user or the browser that we're using.
Oh, wow.
And it was fantastic because, as we know on microservices, when you have canary releases, you can really shape the traffic. And then if something is wrong, you just say, okay, so the new version has 0 traffic, and we go to the old version 100% of the traffic. So let's say you start to gain insights of your development and close the feedback loop basically for the team almost immediately. And the same thing is totally applicable with micro frontends, and that's also for me a huge selling point internally inside the company. If you think about let's say enterprise applications where you have like these massive monolithic code bases that you need to refactor end to end for migrating, for instance, not to a new framework, but the same framework or a newer version, that could take potentially months, if not even years sometimes. So with this approach, basically, you start to say, okay, so I take a slice of my application, I start to deploy in production alongside the legacy application, I start to generate value, I foster my craftsmanship skills for understanding how to do the CI/CD, how to set up the observability part, how to run my micro frontend in production, and all these insights will then be reversed to the next team that is embracing micro frontends, and that will become way faster and with more angles that will be tackled by the teams because a new perspective that is coming from another team. So all this stuff will be very valuable, and you are generating immediate value for your users. That at the end of the day is the whole point why we are writing code. It's not for the naivety of writing code or for implementing a specific design pattern, but it's for generating value for our users.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a good segue in thinking about users and the user experience. Kind of an approach that directly kind of segments different components or different services that all combined make up that user experience. How do you deal with consistency across teams? And this is kind of a user experience question, but also maybe a little bit. We don't have a whole lot of time, but maybe a little bit on how do you share across teams or code something as basic as authentication? Across different micro front ends. How are those types of things handled?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to talk a bit about the sharing part, and then going more in deep about authentication, that is one challenge, and the design system, that is the second challenge. Sharing overall is absolutely fine with micro frontends. The problem for me is understanding when to share, because very often people tend to say, oh, I see 2 occasions of the same code in my code base, then let's abstract that and maybe I can reuse across the project. Unfortunately, in my experience, that is not always the case. Very often, instead, you have 2 occasions in your project, and off you go, that's it. So you have done an abstraction and making your code more complicated just for the naivety of creating that, but not for a real use case. And therefore, for me, it's very, very important that we abstract when it's really needed, because the wrong abstraction is definitely more expensive than code duplicated. And that's the first point that we need to make. Therefore, usually what I say is if you have a very complex component that you want to share or a design system, those are definitely good use cases for sharing code. But otherwise, it's bad. So if you want to optimize for speed and you want to optimize for, let's say, people, the teams, independency of teams, you really need to allow a certain degree of duplication, because it's not always a bad thing. You have time after for rationalize and create consistencies if needed. But at the end of the day, you need to allow the team going with at his own pace and not being every now then disrupted by, oh, I have an external dependency, now I cannot finish this feature because another team has to provide me, I don't know, a specific component.
Two more quick ones, and I'll hand it back to him. What level of kind of decomposition? How micro does a micro front end get, or should be?
Yeah, I would say if we think about microservices and how people are approaching that, we have seen, I would say, different ways. So we move from having function as a service, where it's as small as a function, to having a microservice that is handling maybe a CRUD of a specific domain. Could be like creation of a user, update of a user, delete, and so on. Or we can go on what they call recently macro services, and there are some teams also in enterprise customers that are using. I'm thinking currently about Uber, that there are a couple of teams that they prefer to use one unique instance of their domain instead of segmenting in multiple microservices, because they didn't find, let's say, the use case of splitting up further. And I would say this is exactly the same for microservices. For micro frontends, where you can have a micro frontend that is represented by an entire view or a small single page application. Or it could be as granular as something smaller, like imagine like a large e-commerce where you have hundreds of people working on it, and you have like your micro frontend that is present in multiple views. Imagine, for instance, the review micro frontend, or the suggestion micro frontend, where you have like product related to a specific thing. So these kind of let's say micro frontend could be also multiple inside the same view, or just one per view.
Okay. So it doesn't eliminate the ability to develop single page apps. You can work this.
Not at all. And once again, if we look from the perspective of a business domain on a specific context, because that is very important, the context should drive how far you go with your granularity. If you understand the context, you understand the domain, then you are capable to say, in my specific use case, a small single page application can be represented by micro frontend and can be handled by one single team that is doing everything. On the other side, I would say you can have an extreme use case where I want to have multiple micro frontends because I see a lot of reusability of them across multiple views and multiple parts of my application, and I know the multiple teams will handle that. Therefore, in this case, I can go more granular. I personally think that is very, very important that we spend time understanding the context, because it's very difficult in architecture saying this is the only path to take. For me, often architects reply with it depends, because it's the reality. The context is driving the decision that you need to make, and if you don't understand the context, you cannot say this is the right trade-off for this project or not.
All right, I want to yield the questions to him. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ben, for that line of questions. Let me come back to and push for a little more clarity on this topic, which I am struggling with. I'm not sure if others may be also. That when we talk about bounded context, Luca, in this, are the bounded context in the front end somewhat independent from the bounded context idea on the backend side, meaning the front end you can partition into bounded context, let's say ABC, and on the back end where teams have been doing the microservices, let's say they they break up the bounded context in X, Y, Z, and then expose it via APIs and all that. So, I mean, is that right thinking, or is it more that the bounded context have to be end to end, front end to back end?
No, you can have different bounded contexts inside the same subdomain. And API contracts is a nice way for breaking apart the front end and back end. So in that case, what you could do is either let's say the payment subdomain, and inside the payment subdomain, obviously you have different bounded contexts where the back end can differ from the front end. Maybe the front end can be let's say coarse grain, the granularity that they're going to take, and in the back end will be more fine grain. And that is absolutely fine. You have an API that is basically the front end and back end, the important thing is that you have all the team that is developing that specific subdomain working all together. The beauty of this approach also is the fact that you don't need to have microservices and microfrontends together. You can have a monolithic code base on the back end and microfrontends on the front end. It's absolutely valid point, because in reality, again, the context is telling you what you really need to optimize for. Where is your key differentiator? And in my opinion, the beauty of having an API with API gateway or a backend for front end, you have multiple patterns that will allow you to decouple and assign the responsibility of handling the API layer to the front and the backend team. It's up to the pattern that you're going to decide. But the beauty of this is that you can really slice end-to-end your application, and you can work with cross-functional teams or components teams. In our case, for instance, in my previous job, we were working with components team, because the moment that you start to have, so we were targeting, as I said before, smart TVs, console, web, and mobile, and different type of front-end applications. And you couldn't fit in a team all the expertise, because there were too many languages, and therefore we have to structure the teams in components teams. So that we had a web team for the catalog, but we have also the Roku team for the catalog, and we have the Android team for the catalog on mobile, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, you can apply those concepts on a variety of language, because the architecture at the end is not related to a framework. And the important thing for me is to stress the fact that there isn't, let's say, the perfect solution. Obviously, I would lie if I tell you, oh yeah, you can use I don't know, plugin architecture and on the back end, that you cannot use that or with microfrontends. It's not true. You can always find the right trade-off for doing these kind of things. But the reality is, you really need to understand what is also the impact on the organization, because when we are saying those kind of things, use slice in this way, use slice in that way, use microservices, microfrontends, one of the main challenge on overall is also having let's say the flexibility to set up your organization in a way that this architecture model we are going to strive and work properly, because architecture, organizational structure, and the communication between teams are three parts of a system that are going hand in hand. You cannot forget, you cannot design architecture in isolation, and you cannot design an organizational structure in isolation. There is no way that is going to work. Someone is going to suffer.
Very helpful, Luca. So let's explore this a little further. Given the partitioning that will necessarily happen on the front end, now that you have multiple, whether it's a TV display device or a web browser or even a mobile for that matter, can you talk a little bit about the importance of having a design system? Can you go about this level of front-end partitioning without having a coherent design system? Yeah.
Absolutely. So a design system is composed by design tokens, and therefore definition of I don't know, the font, the color, specific hexadecimal of the color, and so on and so forth. And then you can have design components. So the design UI, so it could be a button and those are basic concepts. It could be a drop down, stuff like that. Then you can even go further and start to compose that and share with the teams. My suggestion is, to avoid doing that, my suggestion would be with micro frontends, stopping at the level of the basic components. So you have raw components that are composable by the teams. Why that? Because the moment that you start to, for instance, taking something that in many cases is as simple as an header, when you start to apply inside the micro frontend, you realize that the context drives different implementation of that component. And it's not as simple as I have a logo, I have 3 links, and off you go. Yes, there are some websites that can handle that. But most majority of the time, when you have an enterprise system, you need to take into account which area the user is navigating, if the user is authenticated or not. I don't know, maybe there are some other information that you need to take care of. And therefore, in that case, if you rely on the team to handle that and you provide good, let's say, structure for handling that, I can guarantee you that it's very unlikely that the front-end developer will mess up an header when they have all the basic components and everything and all the guidelines that they need in order to be implemented. And yes, you may have multiple implementation of the header, but it's not necessarily evil. It could be worse the moment that you start to think about, okay, so now I have let's say one unique component that is the header, and it has to understand all the different domains where it should be implemented, and it has to be deployed simultaneously on the micro frontends, and so on and so forth. So you see that the complexity start to raise because you have a distributed system. It's not a monolithic architecture anymore. The other thing of design system that is very, very important is the governance. And many people are forgetting about that, but I think is the key for, especially on distributed system, to get it right. The first effort is, I created design system. Great. So you have invested in a considerable amount of time for having a design system to create consistency of your UI. So now, let's assume that you deploy first version and is applied on all the micro frontends, is working great. But now suddenly you have a new version, and maybe it's even disruptive. So you need to understand how you're going to make sure that all the micro frontends has the latest version. And usually there are a few options. There are some tools currently available that will allow you to identify visually which micro frontend is using which version of external libraries. There are open source version and let's say commercial versions. Or otherwise, you can use fitness functions. The concept of fitness function is the possibility to test your architecture and your key decisions inside your CI. So in this case, you can have, for instance, inside your CI, a step function that what it does is every time that the micro frontend is built, is checking the package JSON, and in the package JSON, you have basically all your dependencies. You can rely and see in that step which is the latest version of your design system, and even block the build of the micro frontend till the team fix the problem. And that basically allows you a level of granularity that before was slightly different, because before it was all my application as the latest version, all my application as the oldest version. That is not necessarily bad. I would argue probably it's better in that way. But when you work in a distributed system, you need to also to think about this kind of dimension that before with the monolithic code base, you don't have to. And that's also why micro frontends are not for everyone. I think there are certain use cases where they really shine, but a monolithic architecture is still valid. So Jamstack, server-side rendering, and single-page application are definitely here to stay and to stay along, because they are providing a lot of value in several other contexts.
Makes sense, makes sense. Let me let Ben follow up on his line of questions from there on.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. I want to kind of explore a little bit, kind of, the level of granularity again, and this concept of sharing. And, back to my question about authentication, critical services that, managing user context, other things like that. Do you make that part of one of your teams for micro front end? If you're trying to avoid sharing at a bigger component level, how do you address functionality like authentication?
Absolutely. So usually in that case, an authentication with, let's say, some of the most common authentication partners using maybe a JWT token or a session through a cookie. Those are, if you think about that, technically speaking, the moment that you are storing that in a cookie, or the moment that you're storing in local storage or session storage, those are accessible by the entire application. So the logic would be, if I have a micro frontend for authentication, the moment that I have authenticated the user, I can take the token and store in a cookie, or that is let's say the most secure way, or local storage or session storage. At that stage, I can delegate to the authenticated area to rely on the fact that there is a token there, and the authenticated area, what it does is checking that there is a token and pass this token on every API call. So in that case, you maintain the security, and you have these, if you want, global context that is by design available in every browser. And it could be that in our case, for instance, on TV, not always you had the local storage, so you need to store inside the operating system. That was a different kind of problem. But in reality, on web, is extremely easy. You take a token, store in a cookie, everyone has access, and by convention, you know that authenticated areas will pick up the token from there, and then they consume that, they use that in the header and the bearer token for consuming APIs.
Thank you. Thank you. A little bit on the technology. There's this notion of, being technology agnostic, across teams, meeting different teams can use a different version of JavaScript or Angular, or one React, one Angular. Can you speak to kind of the pros and cons of that? It sounds a little scary promoting, kind of lots of different frameworks in the same user experience. Interested to hear what your experience of doing that has been.
Absolutely, and it is scary. The problem is the community thought that micro frontends was a good mechanism for mix and matching different frameworks. I truly believe that the same things. So technically speaking, let's start from this point. Technically speaking, in a single page application, you can have React and Angular working together. No problem at all. No clashes, and it will work. And how many companies are doing that? None, because they know that performance is a problem. The same thing should be applicable for micro frontends. The fact that you can, it doesn't mean that you have to. So my point of view is, there is one or two scenarios where I can see this working, but with a limited amount of, let's say, different frameworks or same framework with different version. That is usually when you migrate from a legacy application to a micro frontends one. In that case, because you know that is for a certain amount of time and is not forever, you can rely on the fact that you have two frameworks that is downloaded to the user. Is not optimal, but the benefit of having the fast feedback loop and gaining insight in production are definitely overcome the performance issue. And bear in mind, if you structure very well your front-end application, also the legacy one, with the latest caching strategies applied by the browser, CDNs, and also origin, different origin, you can really avoid to have too much chattiness on the loading stuff, because the browser nowadays, by default, the moment that you cache, I don't know, React or Angular, they cache it, and next time that you're asking is not even going to the CDN. They are retrieving directly from the browser. Therefore, it doesn't even do a round trip.
Very good. What are the downsides? There's pros and cons with microservices. What about micro front ends?
Downsides, complexity definitely is one, because here we are not simplifying. It's like with microservices, right? So you start to have a similar complexity. How to handle observability, how to make sure that when there is a live incident, you assign the problem to the right team. And consistency is another, UI consistency may be another problem. So you may accept or not, it depends company by company, that maybe one micro frontend has the latest version of the design system, maybe another one is not. The other challenge is around CI/CD. So you need to foster and iterate to have a fast feedback loop. It's not a great experience for developers having 10 minutes of CI before they create a build. They otherwise they will start to find ways to overcome the CI and testing in locally, and risking that they are breaking something worse when they hit production. So it's very, very important you provide the bandwidth of to the developers for thinking about that. And also, I think another important topic that at the beginning for me was very natural, but I have seen customers that at the beginning they are not thinking about that, is the concept of decentralization. So now with the distributed system, instead of having the tech leadership that is taking all the decisions, you are decentralizing the decision making to the teams. Obviously, based also some guardrails. So you start to say the tech leadership, so architects, tech leads, principal engineers will be responsible for the right outcome for the user, and they will provide obviously some guardrails and how to optimize certain code. I don't know, evaluate design patterns that can be applicable in multiple domains, stuff like that. But now you are basically delegating inside certain boundaries the decision making to the teams, and then you need to accept them. And it's not always easy to do that in organizational structure that are very hierarchical.
Thank you. It's good stuff. Hemant, before I hand it over to you, I know the team conversation and team org is a really hot topic in all of this. Really interested to hear, but related to kind of ownership, I did want to ask the question in a agile Scrum type of development environment. Do you have a product owner per micro front end? And the traditional ownership models kind of line up that way when you're thinking of an agile team and micro front ends?
Yeah, that depends from the organization. I would say the maturity of agile that they have. I've seen, let's say, organization that they have one product owner on one team, but there are not many. Vast majority of the time, product owner is shared across, I don't know, 2 or 3 teams, not too many, because otherwise it could be, let's say, quite complicated to handle. But usually with similar domain. So for instance, if we think about payments, then we have different teams that are dealing with that specific, let's say, subdomain. Then the product owner will lead that part, and we created stories and everything for having a cohesive let's say, point of view for the user, because at the end, the product owner is representing the user in this case. But in general, the approach that we are taking normally with Scrum or Kanban or whatever other agile methodology you like to take is not going to be impacted at all. I think is more interesting to understand the communication flows between teams and trying to avoid external dependencies, because that is something that usually disrupt the morale of developers and also slow down the release of new features.
Gotcha. Yeah. Hemant, take it away.
Let's explore this further. This is a good logical kind of a progression of this team structure topic itself. So in the beginning, you said one of the reasons to do micro front end is to be able to have more scalable, less coupling between the teams, and be able to have teams work independently and pick up speed. So can you explain a little more, maybe through an example, perhaps, Luca, to take a complex front end and how do you partition them across logical teams, like you said, maybe a header team or something like that, and then push that thinking further into your idea that you have touched in another podcast, the inverse conway maneuver, kind of connect these ideas for the engineering leaders who are trying to figure out how do you structure your teams to take advantage
Absolutely.
of it.
So let's start first of all defining what the Conway's law is, I would say. And the Conway's law states that you usually tend to design your system based on your organizational structure. It's not new. It was created in 1974, if I remember well. So definitely has a few years, and this is quite true. I think we are starting to realize and see it in action in quite few places. And usually, and there isn't nothing wrong. It's an observation, right? So that's the way how we are used to do that. Or there is the opposite way. So we design an architecture and we restructure our organization for mimicking what the architecture is doing. And also in this case, there is nothing wrong with that. It's more unlikely, I would say, because obviously you are impacting a lot of people, but it's an observation in either case, so Conway's law and inverse Conway's maneuver, that has to be, let's say, acknowledged by the architects and the team that are working on this. Therefore, for me, for instance, when I started my first project with this approach was studying how the user was interacting with the application, and also knowing the requirements and the goal that every single product team would like to have on a specific area of the application. There are several ways that you can handle micro frontends, and I created like a mental model called the decision framework that you can read more on Medium or in my blog post around that. But the interesting part for me is starting to understand how the user behave. And what I've experienced, for instance, was that we had like millions of users every day going to the landing page, then a drop of 30% or more or less on the sign-in, sign-up experience. And from there, a new user had another drop of, I don't know, 20, 30, I don't remember exactly, but a certain percentage. So that means that the new user, before seeing the authenticated area, only one on two would see the authenticated area. And in 1 million of users, it means that 500,000 of users has to download all the code of all the applications, and they will never benefit from it. They just download it. With micro frontends, what we started is, okay, let's try to be smart. So we have millions of customers going to the landing page, and we want the landing page to be loaded as fast as possible. That's the first micro frontend. And then we did the authentication micro frontend, where we had the sign in, sign up, payment, retrieve email, retrieve password, and then we have the authenticated micro frontend. Then we have customer support. We have the chat, and we started to basically, based on the numbers that we have seen, starting to slice our experiences. And suddenly what we discovered was an authenticated user it's very unlikely, like it was less than 10% was moving away from the authenticated area. So that means the SDK for the credit card, the SDK for PayPal, and all the other payment methods we had, all the information that were stored in the authentication area landing page or other areas, they weren't downloaded anymore. So finally, the user was just downloaded what was needed for accomplish his own user experience. And that for me was, let's say, great, because then on low-end devices allowed us to introduce new features that before we couldn't, because the memory footprint was occupied by code that at the end was dead code inside of the machine, because the user that was authenticated didn't want to go out from their authenticated area on I don't know, a set-top box that you basically use a remote for navigating the application.
Yeah, no, this is a very, very helpful, tangible example of how you go about breaking in the team. Let's kind of start winding down. I think we're at 48-minute mark, and we can go on this topic, but I think we've got to respect the audience. So any kind of anti-patterns and things you see that teams who get excited after hearing all this and jump on the bandwagon, what to guard against, what not to do?
The first for me anti-pattern is trying to map micro frontends to components. I think you really need to sit down and understand for your context what a component is and what a micro frontend is. As a rule of thumb, I would say that when you start to have let's say an element, let's call it that way, that is extremely extensible, you are implementing a component, because otherwise it means that basically it has to live inside a specific let's say domain, and the domain often is injected or is the parent object that is, or the host of this element has to know enough for orchestrating the component or the element in this case. So that is a component. The moment that you have a micro frontend, usually you have a communication that is happening with other part of the system through event emitters or a pub sub pattern, whatever it is. Could be event emitter, observables, or whatever it is. Global state is another anti-pattern, because if you do the effort of splitting up multiple micro frontends and you load them in the same view with let's say a shared state, you are invalidating all the effort that you're doing. You are basically going against, once again, to the distributed monolith. I would say the other anti-pattern that it's more organizational. You don't think that you need to change anything because you are changing the architecture. In reality, it's very, very important that you go hand in hand when you decide to change architecture, also to revise not only once, but constantly, and maybe every quarter or every 6 months, the organization structure, because business is evolving and what we are building are live systems. And we need to, let's say, match or trying to be as close as possible to the business needs. And before doing that, because we have living systems, we need to revise what we have, the assumption we have made, I don't know, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and then apply them to the technical part.
That's a great list of anti-patterns. Thank you, Luca. Ben, any other questions in your mind that we haven't covered yet?
Perhaps a little bit more on quality and testing. How does this change the way we think about testing the user interface? You know, clearly your CI pipeline can handle a lot, but when I think about regression testing the full app, what happens there?
Yeah, that's a good point. So on micro frontends, unit test and integration test are exactly the same, are even easier, because instead of testing the entire application end to end, you then really double down on your domain, so that because your cognitive load is smaller, you start to be more familiar and you know which kind of test you need to write properly. End-to-end testing is a challenge, especially when you have multiple micro frontends in the same view. And in the front end ecosystem, the pyramid, as it was called by Martin Fowler, of testing, where you have a strong unit test and then slightly less integration test and less end-to-end testing. I cannot say that is reverted, but there are school of thought where end-to-end testing became quite prominent. And therefore, for micro frontends, when you have end-to-end testing, the way to do that is through proxying. There are solutions that allows you to basically saying, okay, I need to rely, I'm building this part of the view and I have other 2 micro frontends in the same view, but I need to test everything end to end. So how can I do that? So there, if you use Webpack, for instance, the dev server allow you to proxy, but there are other techniques. If there are a plugin of Webpack called Module Federation that allows you to set up the URL where you can find the other micro frontends and so on and so forth. So you are basically defining stable micro frontends that are available, that are outside your domain but are inside your view, and you can do end-to-end testing relying on stable version running on staging or production even of those micro frontends, and you need to set up that in your CI/CD. It's less complex than how it seems, but it's an exercise that maybe we are not too used to, and therefore we need to learn that.
Yeah. Thank you. Great.
Excellent. Well, there are probably many lines of questions. We can keep going, but out of respect, we're coming on to an hour, and that's the upper bound of this format we use. So let me ask, and there are many questions that have come, and I've just not been able to keep up. So my request to audiences, we're happy to follow up on the questions you have, but let's wrap this one up with one final question, which is people who's got interested in the idea by attending this session today, or have been interested in the idea and came to the session. Any resources you'll point them to? Good books, good website? I know you have a book coming up. What should someone read to kind of bone up more?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently there are 2 books that are already available. One is called Micro Frontends in Action. Another one is The Art of Micro Frontends. And then there is my book is coming in Q4 this year, that is from O'Reilly. It's slightly different than the approach that I'm taking, because I didn't rush to write. It's a 2 years effort for me, and it is going to an end at the end of this month. It was not only applying all the experience that I had in the trenches, but then I did the extra mile on researching what others were doing and applying the same concept, talking with multiple customers around the world, and seeing in practice, in different contexts, the let's say learnings that I have done in mine, and seeing them succeeding. So let's say the interesting point that in mine took a bit longer, but for the good reason that I really wanted to see that in action, and learn from others. I basically added some let's say insights inside my book, because I was talking with other customers, and they were saying, I have this problem, how would you solve it? And I didn't have that problem in my context, and thanks to them, I am capable to provide even a broader let's say approach and techniques and patterns inside the book. So I'm pretty happy.
Excellent, thank you, and we'll try to include them in the follow-up communication we do with the audience. Anything else, Jill, we need to do by way of wrap up on this?
I think we're good. We'll come up with a little blog on all the questions, and maybe we can answer those online and send out a link, so that, because there's a lot of questions that have come in. So we could go on all afternoon, I think. So this was an excellent topic.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Luca, for joining us, and we look forward to your book coming out. And thank you, Ben, for helping us fully explore this topic.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Hema.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.